You all can thank Sister Adrian Smith for this one. We are at www.smithsonianmag.com. We are at a topic, heading, title, The Misguided Focus on 1619 as the Beginning of Slavery in the U.S. Damages Our Understanding of American History. And it should say it damages our understanding of slavery, but we'll just keep going. The year the first enslaved Africans, were brought to Jamestown is drilled into students' memories, but overemphasizing this date distorts history. This is a fairly long article, so please bear with me. In 1619, 1620, and odd Negroes arrived off the coast of Virginia, where they were bought for victual, which is pretty much people who provide provisions and things like that for a ship, who cooks, by labor-hungry English colonists. The story of these captain Africans has set the stage for countless scholars and teachers interested in telling the story of slavery in English Northern America. Unfortunately, 1619 is not the best place to begin a meaningful inquiry into the history of African peoples in America. Certainly, there was a story that begins in 1619, but it is neither well suited to help us understand slavery as an institution, nor to help us better grasp the complicated place of African peoples in the early modern Atlantic world. For too long, the focus on 1619 has led the general public and scholars alike to ignore more important issues, and worse, silently accept unquestioned assumptions that continue to impact us in remarkably consequential ways. As a historical signifier, 1619 may be more insidious than instructive. The overstated significance of 1619, still a common fixture in American history curriculum, begins with the question most of us re- reflect, reflexively ask when we consider the first documented arrival of a handful of people from Africa in a place that would one day become the United States of America. First, what was the status of the newly arrived African men and women? Were they slaves, servants, something else? And second, as Winthrop Jordan wondered in the preface in his 1968 classic, White Over Black, what did the white inhabitants of Virginia think that these dark-skinned people were rowed ashore and traded for provisions? Were they shocked? Were they frightened? Did they notice these people were black? If so, did they care? In truth, these questions fail to approach the subject of Africans in America in a historically responsible way. None of these queries conceive a newly arrived African as actors in their own right. These questions also assume that the arrival of these people was an exceptional historical moment, and they reflect the worries and concerns of the world we inhabit rather than shedding useful light on the unique challenges of life in the early 17th century. There are important historical correctives to the misplaced marker of 1619 that can help us ask better questions about the past. Most obviously, 1619 was not the first time Africans could be found in English Atlantic colony, and it certainly wasn't the first time people of African descent made their mark and imposed their will on the land that would someday be part of the United States. As early as May 1616, blacks from the West Indies were already at work in Bermuda providing expert knowledge about the cultivation of tobacco. There was also suggestive evidence that scores of Africans plundered from the Spanish were aboard a fleet under the command of Sir Francis Drake when he arrived at Roanoke in 1586. In 1526, enslaved Africans were a part of Spanish expedition to establish an outpost on the North American coast in the present-day South Carolina. Those Africans launched a rebellion in November of that year and effectively destroyed the Spanish settlers' ability to sustain the settlement. They abandoned a year later, nearly 100 years before Jamestown. African actors enabled American colonies to survive, and they were equally able to destroy European colonial ventures. Stop right there. The Roanoke colony was a failure, just to go ahead and let y'all know. And that's why, because apparently, now that's not written in the book White Trash that I've read and that I've done the review on, but that's an interesting thing to go ahead and bring to the forefront that is relevant. I'll go ahead and carry it forth. These stories highlight additional problems with exaggerating the importance of 1619, privileging the date That date in Chesapeake region effectively erases the memory of many more African peoples than it memorializes. Excuse me. The From this point forward and in this place narrative arc silences the memory of more than 500,000 African men, women, and children who had already crossed the Atlantic against their will, aided and abetted Europeans in their endeavors, provided expertise and guidance in a range of enterprises, suffered, died, and most importantly, endured. Woo! Hallelujah. Let me go ahead and keep it pushing. That Sir John Hawkins was behind 4 slave trading expeditions during the 1560s suggests the degree to which England had been more invested in African slavery than we typically recall. Tens of thousands of Englishmen and women had meaningful contact with African peoples throughout the Atlantic world before Jamestown. In this light, the events in 1619 were a bit yawn-inducing than we typically allow. Telling the story of 1619 as an English story also ignores the entirely transnational nature of the early modern Atlantic world and the way competing European powers collectively facilitated racial slavery, even as they disagreed about and fought over almost everything else. Did you hear that? Only about the slavery shit did they all agree on. Everything else, no agreement. From the early 1500s forward, the Portuguese, Spanish, English, French, Dutch, and others fought to control the resources of the emerging transatlantic world and worked together to facilitate the dislocation of the indigenous peoples of Africa and the Americas. Did you hear that? Let's read that again. From the early 1500s forward, the Portuguese, Spanish, French, English, Dutch, and others fought to control the resources of the emerging transatlantic world and worked together to facilitate the dislocation of the indigenous peoples of Africa and the Americas. As historian John Thornton has shown us, the African men and women who appeared almost as if by chance in Virginia 1619 were there because of a chain of events involving Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, and England. Virginia was part of the story. But it is a blip on the radar screen. These concerns about the making too much of 1619 are likely familiar to some readers, but they are not even the biggest problem with overemphasizing this one very specific moment in time. The worst aspect of overemphasizing 1619 may be the way it has shaped Black experience of living in America since that time. As we near the 400th year anniversary of 1619, and new works appear that are timed to remember the firstness of the arrival of a few African men and women in Virginia, it is important to remember the historical framing shapes historical meaning. Listen, it is important to remember that historical framing shapes historical meaning. So that means that how you put the history together is how people perceive the history. There we go. How we choose to characterize the past has important consequences for how we think about today and what we can change for tomorrow. In that light, the most poisonous consequences of raising the curtain with 1619 is that it casually normalizes the Christian Europeans as historical constants and makes African actors little more than dependent variables in the effort to understand what it means to be American. Elevating 1619 has unintended consequences of cementing in our minds that those very same Europeans had lived quite precipitously and very much on death's doorstep on the wisp of America were in fact already home. But of course they were not. So what they're saying right there is that the people that people believe were already here, right on, they were never here. They didn't just belong here. They don't just belong here. Okay, they didn't just wake up because they're indigenous to the land. Thank you very much. Selective memory has conditioned us to employ terms like settlers and colonists when we would better be serving the thinking of the English as invaders or occupiers. In 1619, Virginia was still Senocomic. Europeans were the non-native species, and the English were the illegal aliens. Uncertainty was very much the order of the day. When we make the mistake of fixing this place and time as inherently or inevitably English, we prepare the ground for the assumption that the United States already existed in embryonic fashion. When we allow that idea to go unchallenged, we silently condone the notion that this place is and always been and always has been white, Christian, and European. Where does that leave African and people of African descent? Unfortunately, the same insidious logic of 1619 that reinforces the illusion of white preeminence necessitates that the blacks can only be ipso facto, abnormal, impermanent, and only tolerable to the degree that they adapt themselves to someone else's fictional universe. Remembering 1619 may be a way of accessing the memory and dignifying the early presence of black people in a place that will become the United States, but it also imprints in our minds, our national narratives, and our history books that blacks are not from these parts. When we elevate the events in 1619, we establish the condition for people of African descent to remain forever strangers in a strange land. It doesn't have to be this way. We shouldn't ignore that something worth remembering happened in 1619. There are certainly stories worth telling and lives worth remembering. But history is also an exercise in crafting narratives that give voice to the past in order to engage with the present. The year 1619 might seem long ago for some more attuned to the politics of life in the 21st century, but if we can do a better job of situating the foundational story of black history and the history of slavery in North America in its proper context, then perhaps we can articulate an American history that doesn't essentialize notions of us and them, and the broadest possible and various understandings of those words. That would be a pretty good first step, and it would be much easier to sink our teeth into the rich and varied issues that continue to roil the world today. This story was originally published on Black Perspectives, an online platform for public scholarship on global black thought, history, and culture. But it made it to the Smithsonian.com. Believes that. Adrian Smith, my sister. Roderick Smith, my brother. I appreciate y'all so much. Really do. Everybody else, you guys know I appreciate you. You guys know I appreciate you. From even the crazy guy Lamont Sims to people that I obviously, clearly have so much love for, like Teddy Bowser, my Martin Ettis, my Andre Wickhams, the Mike Woodards when they show up, the JP Hopes, all my people. I love all y'all. I really do. I love my people. Haven't seen DeClean Thomas in a while, that sister, but she'll be back around one day. I could probably think of everybody. I'm not gonna go crazy about it. I wanted to read that to you to give you perspective. I've been saying for a long time, you can go back to some of my first videos. I've always said that I don't believe that 1619 was the year slavery started. I've said that for a long time. I even have videos that even go into the fact that slavery started way before that, but we're not going to go into all that. We're just going to stay here. Sister, Scribe, like a lot of other people, the first thing I ever heard Scribe say was 1619. A lot of other people. If you've ever seen in my video 1619, that's the only picture that they have for a year of the 400-year period. They won't give us another 400-year period because they don't want you to know that you may have been here longer than 400 years. The wicked deviseth wicked devices, even though the needy speaketh righteous. Right? So, though you might speak something righteous or right or just, doesn't matter because they're wicked. And they've already devised something wicked against you. However, if you have taken all of this into consideration, I would ask you to do one more thing for me, please, my brother and my sister. Take into consideration, deep consideration, as I read to you about things like the Renault colony and how the lady in the book, White Trash, used words like the African. And then she would say things like the Negro. Then she would say things like the indigenous. So understand that they knew And once again, it started, the article was saying this. Let me remind you as I get ready to end it out. It said, and odd Negroes. Odd Negroes. Odd, meaning that they are already, that means that the Negroes that they were used to seeing aren't these type of Negroes. Can you dig it? So that means that these are different people. However, with that said, I would just like for people to take all of this into consideration. I will be doing a live stream again. I will cover this same information, but we will cover it more in depth with the thought of mind that people have actually viewed this information. So I'm going to put this up now, and then in about 4 hours, I'm going to do a live stream, or I might even wait till tomorrow to do my live stream. So I'm going to wait till tomorrow to do the live stream, but I'm going to put this up now, and then you will get to see all these things. With that said, I appreciate your time. I appreciate everything that you've done for me to give my mind clarity. It is a blessing and an honor. And may the Most High give our minds better understanding as we go forth. I am not diminishing, nor do I mean to demean any of my brothers and sisters as I speak. I just simply mean to speak on the things that I have heard people either say or put forth with their own words. With that said, you take it easy.